Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is the Web Platform Podcast. We are on episode number 50, the big 50. And today we're going to be talking about CSS and some pretty awesome things that are happening in the CSS world. On our panel today we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Nick Niemeir. Okay, and our guest today is Tab Atkins Jr.
Hello.
Can you introduce yourself to everyone and tell everyone who you are, what you do, what's awesome about you?
So, Tab Atkins Jr., I work for Google on the Chrome team, and specifically, I do a lot of specification work. I mostly work in CSS standards, but also do a lot of side work in SVG, HTML, and JavaScript-related things.
And I've been following a lot of the stuff you've been doing over the past years, and it's pretty amazing. CSS has been incredible. I love it so much, and I know a lot of developers they fear the CSS, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
So can you tell us why it was originally created and what problems did it solve then, and are those problems still true today, or does it solve different problems?
Yeah, so I also got a link, I should probably give him the resources later, but the history of CSS, which is a really interesting document written by Bert Bose, the creator of CSS, who's still a member of the CSS working group. And you ever read that back, it's really interesting looking at the kinds of things they tried to invent before CSS happened to actually do styling of web pages. There's stuff based on JavaScript, there's stuff based on like Lisp, basically, a bunch of other weird transformations. But ultimately, it's just attempting to keep the... It was originally designed to maintain the ideal of HTML as a content delivery thing, like that has semantic meaning. And by that I mean that more you can figure out in ways other than just looking at it. In particular, that machines can understand. That's the important part of the word semantic. And by keeping these styles separated from that so that you could potentially swap out the styles, but at the very least you could have a reasonably understandable unstyled page and then the actual pretty styled page. It was an attempt to help keep that separation in place and still let you have all the styling power that you had in Microsoft Word, etc., which was one of the big... Word and tech were the big things that people were like, we can style in there, why can't we style on the web?
I remember the days of front page development.
Yeah, this was back. It was created back in '95, so these things were still like big back then.
There's a lot that's happened in CSS because in the beginning, right, this whole idea of, at least when I started like maybe with CSS 2003 around, and it had been out already for a little while. I think 1996 or 97, something like that, right?
Yep.
And I remember it was a lot about making stuff pretty and a lot about separating your presentation from your structure. And now we have things like web components, shadow DOM, scope CSS, variables, the Cascade. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the we're running into some issues with CSS now. When it was originally designed, the web consisted of documents. There were not applications on the web. Insofar as there were applications at all, they were done in like real programming languages. And so CSS was designed for that purpose, for the purpose of styling documents. Early CSS was all text. It was all about styling text and lists and tables and things like that would show up in a book or an article or something like that. They could not have anticipated the web becoming the generic programming platform that it is today. And that's why we're running into some of the issues now that we're trying to solve with better componentization. You have applications that needed different types of styling. If anybody, I'm very happy to be responsible for Flexbox and Grid now because Flexbox is making styling of applications so much easier. I started that because I was a web developer 6 or 7 years ago, and it was the worst thing. Trying to do everything with floats and inline blocks and tables and everything like that. Starting off, we've been trying to make CSS more application-focused, trying to add more features for the development of applications. And that ties into higher componentization stuff, where you're able to separate out parts of your page from each other so that they don't mess with each other as much. So web components is the first big one. It actually won't be the first to land, probably, like in terms of developer usage, because it's been taking so long for standardization and to get all the browsers to agree with each other. But web components is basically, hey, you remember jQuery components? Let's do those but better. So basically taking some element in your page and being able to upgrade it into something more complicated without revealing all the structure inside of it. It looks like just some simple little element in your page, but inside there's a full bit of DOM, there might be a calendar, there might be whatever, anything in there. And that lets you scope your CSS too. Any CSS you use inside of there doesn't jump out and style the rest of your page accidentally. So you can use easy CSS, like an A selector inside of there, instead of having to always qualify everything with some namespace and IDs and whatnot to make sure it's scoped to just the part you want. But web components are only the very first part of this. We're actually going for componentization more heavily in a lot of other ways. CSS variables were designed with this in mind as well. It's why we didn't, when we invented CSS variables, we did not go with a design like what the preprocessors use, like what SAS uses. They do global variables. They have scoped variables for their functions and mixins and whatnot as well, but generally when you set a variable, it's accessible throughout the entire document. And we specifically instead used properties for our variables. So whenever you set a variable, a custom property, it only applies to that element and its subtree that it inherits to. So that way you can take a piece of your page and set a variable to a particular value. Everything below that sees it. The rest of your page sees the original value or no value at all, whatever. So I've been trying to find places where I can insert heavier componentization into CSS without having to do radical changes to the overall, let's just put everything in a giant global namespace model that it normally works on.
That's good. I didn't even realize that those are scoped in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty awesome.
Most of the time you just put them on the root, and so then it applies to the whole document anyway. But if you need different values, just parts of your page, it's quite easy.
Yeah, that's how I've been doing it, is through the root. Using it in Polymer. I know Justin's been doing this too, where we're putting it, we're using the polyfills that's available inside of Polymer 1.0. But that's not something that's accessible outside of Polymer. It's built into the library. So there's myth.io for polyfilling this, and I'm not sure how good that is, though. I haven't really played with it. Go ahead. Sorry.
So like Myth and oh shoot, what was that? There's another pre-processing CSS one that tries to keep with the syntax of CSS. Anyway, all of them, whenever they do variables, they're using a subset of variables, only allowing them on the root, because that's the subset that you can do with a preprocessor, because they're global if they're on the root. Once we get them in browsers, which they're already in Firefox, we're just about to be shipping them in Chrome. Like they're this close. And I believe that Safari has an implementation of them. They might be prefixed or something that's weird. And I presume Edge is going to come out with them soon too, a new Internet Explorer browser. So within a year or two, variables will actually be usable for real across the web, which should be really exciting there.
Yeah, it's under consideration. I saw it for Edge.
Yeah.
What's interesting too is, like, I've used SAS for quite some few years, since I think 2009. I've been using SAS as my preprocessor of choice, and the variables there are great. But I think people are like, oh, well, why do we need variables in CSS? We already have SAS to do this, and there's a lot of things you can do on the fly in the browser that you can't really calculate on build time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and well, there's some interesting examples in the spec already of ways you can use variables, use the cascading nature of variables, the inheriting nature, in ways that you can't really do in a preprocessor. And once we get the real custom properties spec that lets you do much more fancy things with custom properties, there will be a lot of amazing things that you can do with those that you can't do anywhere near with preprocessors. Like, for example, just being able to set default values or have a value that accumulates as you go down a tree. One example that I've run into before is wanting to do a nested list, like a directory structure, that still keeps a full, whenever you like hover over it, it highlights the entire row, not just starting at the indentation, which is if you use margins or padding or something to indent, and you then use a background color, you'll just get the like part that's indented already. And there's not much you can do around that. You have to use margins or padding, and that necessarily shifts the entire element over a bit. But using variables that accumulate as you go down, you just have a calc that adds 10 pixels to the existing variable and sets it to the same variable again. Using that, you can just accumulate a nesting value and use that just on the element's own padding, so it doesn't get shifted. It's still the full width the whole time. That might work better in a picture, actually. But there's all sorts of fun examples of things you can do with the fact that you can accumulate variables as you go down the tree and whatnot that will be fun to use. I'm really excited to see how people work with them.
And you said you're part of the working group for CSS, which is for the World Wide Web Consortium. You're also on Houdini as well, which was something that Jacob Rossi had mentioned to me once. And I mean, why don't you explain what it is before I assume?
Okay, so first of all, Houdini is a task force inside of the CSS working group. It's dedicated to keeping CSS alive for the next decade or more by way of making CSS extensible. CSS is a really big language already. A lot of people complain about that fairly regularly. It's got 400 plus properties in it, and it keeps wanting to grow. People keep wanting to do more things and whatnot. And this isn't sustainable if it's just the slow standards process and browser adoption that drives the growth, because it's just too slow. If you want something today, it'll be 5 years if you're lucky before it's actually usable everywhere. And that's ridiculous. Not to mention, we have to guess what's going to be useful in 5 years, and we don't have a great track record with that. So Houdini is all about taking CSS and, as much as possible, opening it up to extension, mainly via JavaScript, so that authors can do their own features in CSS, distribute them as libraries and whatnot, and then the iteration process from idea to actually using in a browser drops from 5 years to a week, however much time it takes you to actually program it and distribute it to people. And then, ideally, we should be able to see what's really popular, see what everybody's using, and take the best ideas and then claim that we invented them and put them in CSS, the real language. If we need a proper homepage that describes the project a little better, hopefully somewhat less snarkily than I just did. Basically, yeah, we are taking all the little bits, custom properties, custom @ rules, functions and values, being able to do custom images in CSS so that you could, for example, reproduce realistic shadows instead of whatever box shadow does, or anything else you want. You want conic gradients? You should be able to do those in JavaScript very easily and have them work within the CSS painting pipeline. You want custom layouts. You want to do masonry style layout? That's been popular forever. You should be able to do that in actual CSS and just invoke that rather than having to work around it with JavaScript and whatnot. So all of these are things that we're trying to open up for experimentation with authors.
So is this similar to how behaviors used to work with the HTC files you'd reference back in the day?
They're similar conceptually or spiritually, but in actual action, they don't work like that. Behaviors were little JavaScript files that were invoked by specifying a CSS property, the behavior property, and that meant they could be put on and taken off, and you had to deal with the cascade and whatnot. They had a lot of weird technical issues that made them not a good thing. Today's Houdini stuff knows the mistakes that were made back then and is trying its best to engineer around them and make sure that we're not having weird interactions or JavaScript operating at weird times when the browser doesn't expect it. One big part of that is going to be more isolated scripting contexts. If you want to run JavaScript-based layouts, for example, right now you can do that with absolute positioning, etc., but you have to control the entire thing. You have to know what size the container is because it can't auto-size itself, or rather, you can't respond to it auto-sizing. So you have to know what size the container is, and you have to either guess or do some complicated hacks to measure the size of children if they're using normal CSS layout, as they usually are once you get down to text level at least. So if you want to inject real JavaScript into the layout that works properly, you need to be able to run JavaScript during the layout process. And that means while the browser is doing its C++ or its Rust or anything, there needs to be some way to say, all right, now JavaScript, go. And that needs to happen without JavaScript screwing with the rest of the page, ideally. So,
good luck.
Yeah. So the way around that, basically workers. We're planning to create a new type of worker that's even more limited than normal workers right now. All it gets is like some math functions and then a bit of information about the page or about the element and its surrounding context in a read-only sort of fashion. And then you can just run your computations in there, you output the information you need, and that's it. You can't touch anything else. So it's safe to run in the middle of a complicated process. You won't accidentally invalidate pointers and cause a memory panic or anything. And we're planning to do that like all over the place, actually. We'll have layout workers, we'll have paint workers for doing custom images, we might have scroll workers for doing custom scroll effects and whatnot. It turns out once you start thinking about this, a lot of things could use JavaScript in the middle of some complicated process, and so we'll need these sort of isolated worlds for that kind of thing.
So you're expecting this to take less time, I'm assuming, than something like Flexbox? Because I remember last year when you spoke at CSS Conf, you had said it took 5 years for Flexbox, right?
Yes.
And now, I know the ECMAScript group they're doing TC39, they're doing every year they're doing a release, and the CSS working group, maybe I missed it. Like, how often are these things getting ratified and then handed off to browser vendors?
So we don't do like one big yearly release. It's really nice that TC39 has switched over to a yearly model because they do a single the JavaScript spec, and having that take 5 or 6 years before it gets updated was really frustrating. So CSS instead has a bunch of different modules completely separated that can advance on their own, and Flexbox being one of them. The 5-year figure that I gave at CSSConf last year was accurate from like me starting to work on it to it being done and being implemented in browsers. In the middle, it didn't take 5 years just to like produce a spec. I produced a bunch of specs as we went along and published repeatedly throughout that. And that's generally how we work. We try to publish everything at least once a year. Don't always make it, but at least we're attempting, given the old college try for it. And the idea here with Houdini is that, well, it will still probably take a few years to finish all the bits, especially the more complicated bits. Custom layout and custom paint being the more complicated parts of it will take a few years to get everything nailed down and agreed on and implemented widely enough. But the idea is once that's done, the entire feedback cycle will be super fast then. So this is like the last big feedback push that we have to do before CSS is more self-sustaining. And I think it's just in time, too, because we're running into a lot of weirdnesses with people trying to do a lot more native-style things in their web pages and running into the limitations of CSS with this. And they're iterating fast enough. As soon as they come up with a good idea they want, by the time we even put out an editor's draft, by the time we see that it's popular, they're already moving on to the next thing. And we should be able to let them do that within weeks rather than have to wait a year before we can even tell that it might be a good idea.
Yeah, as a web developer, I kind of take it for granted that CSS I feel like is a staple. Like you wouldn't have a reason not to use it in web development. And Houdini, the whole purpose you said is to keep it alive for the next 10 or so years. Is there? What are the big complaints that people are saying?
So, the big one is what I've been harping on a few times. It's just that the cycle time from someone comes up with an idea to it's usable for every browser is really long, multiple years. Even in the absolute best case, when you're doing some small JavaScript feature, some small DOM feature, you're still looking at 6 months to a year for like a tiny change. And that's still that's assuming you can polyfill it in old browsers because of Safari and IE's release cycle times. And CSS is much slower than that in general. It cycles much slower because it's a much more complicated kind of thing. So that's the majority thing. It's just people want to do a lot of things with CSS. They're all good ideas, but we just can't continue to develop all of them at standards body pace or at browser implementer pace. We've only got a finite number of engineers, They're working on not just new features, but maintaining old features, trying to improve performance overall. And every new feature we add, it reduces performance, so then you have to compensate for that. And just really working on a lot of things other than CSS, and they can't add as many features as we would like. So being able to do more of it on your own, distributing all the computation work to library authors, should help out a lot with velocity there, make us a lot happier.
But as we sort of change, a lot of the things we do now, you have mobile phones, and you have your desktops, and you have your tablets. But the next phase of things, realistically, is on a whole bunch of devices we don't quite know what they look like, right? I mean, in terms of things like wearables and the television sets, and now with things like VR, with WebVR and whatnot. I mean, are specs really chasing their tails when we're doing this? I mean, realistically, specs are always going to be a little bit behind the curve. Like, the expectation can't be that we're going to be ever ahead of it, really.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem I'm trying to allude to here. Here's a very specific example. I don't have it on me, but I have a smartwatch, one of those nice round ones from Motorola, and it's got a tiny screen that is round. Every screen I've ever had in my life has been rectangular. And you want to display things a little bit differently on round screens. Ideally, you want more roundness in general. You also want to be able to position things like around the edges of the screen without having to do trigonometry. And so Samsung has some suggested spec with a couple of features for this, the round display spec. And I need to go do some review on it and whatnot because it's clearly written by like first-timers for specs. But the features there are they're good ideas, but they are, I'm sure, not something that will be useful 5 years from now. Or they will be very minor and we'll need a bunch more stuff along those same lines. And that's not a sustainable thing, because it's watches today, it's round watches today, it's different types of wearables in the future. You're wearing glass, we can't really design well for that screen. We're going to go crazy with the display space and whatnot, and we won't be able to adapt anywhere near fast enough with the web platform if we just stick with today's way of doing things. And Houdini's the way to fix that, or at least our attempt to. Maybe we'll get it wrong. Who knows?
Well, I mean, in terms of developers today, right? I mean, it's always an interesting end game, right? You've got the people who are using Sass, you've got the people who are, trying all these different things. I mean, how are you guys filtering all this content that's coming out of coming out from the general developer community in the working group? Because I mean, I can only imagine that must be a significant nightmare.
It's difficult, but honestly, just listening to friends on Twitter is often enough to help filter things to me. I know a lot of brilliant people that I follow. They find a lot of trends and talk about them, and that's generally okay. For example, I'm really good friends with Chris Epstein of the Sass community. I was just out drinking with him on Friday. And so anything interesting that happens in Sass that might be applicable to CSS, he tells me about. And the same thing for a whole bunch of other bits. I'm acquaintances with Ibrin and a bunch of React folk and Ember folk and whatnot. And yeah, I just get a lot of information through, and other people from the working group have the same deal. They Leah Veru has her finger on the pulse of a lot of the design community, and it actually ends up being not as hard as it might seem to somebody. If you're just trying to seek everything out yourself, very difficult. If you're able to sit on top of a pyramid of people that are just feeding things to you, much easier.
So, I mean, this is a good point. I mean, do you feel like there's a renaissance happening now in CSS? Because for a long time, it didn't seem like there was. And then now we have this big explosion of creativity in the space.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I can, being both on the web dev side and all the way on the source end of the spec development side, I can see these trends happening. CSS was fairly static for a while from 2005 to 2010. And that's right when I joined the working group and started trying to do everything. So me and Fantasy, Elika Etemad of the working group, and a few other people started writing a ton of specs, trying to add a bunch of things that were overdue now that CSS 2.1 was finished. And that's the big wave that you're seeing now in things being really useful in CSS. But also just the polyfill community, the preprocessor community, the big framework communities, those are leading to some amazing developments in terms of like new ideas coming into web development and CSS. And I want to benefit a lot more from those if possible.
So there is a lot of new stuff coming into the pipe. I mean, what are some of the cool things that really stand out in your mind, sans things like Houdini, which are really cool, that are sort of in the pipe or, have just landed?
Okay, so I give this talk periodically. It's one of my favorite conference talks to give. The future of CSS is upcoming specs and whatnot. The pipeline slowed a bit because generally we're trying to devote more effort to Houdini and related things. So new features are a little bit slower right now coming in, but we still have a lot of things that are in active development that haven't really splashed on the web yet. And my big one that I'm super excited about is grid layout, which is the companion to Flexbox layout. Where Flexbox has all these powers to lay out things in a line, grid lays out things in a two-dimensional grid. And with the combination of these two, everything you had to learn about how to do layout on a page could be completely forgotten. All those ridiculous hacks. You'll be able to just use layout, Flexbox and grid, to lay out your page in a very easy fashion, and then just deal with blocks and tables and whatnot at the actual content level where it's supposed to be.
We'll have all new hacks.
There will be all new hacks, absolutely. No doubt about it. I've already seen some pretty amazing hacks with Flexbox that I'm excited to see. I never imagined that it would work that way when I was developing all the algorithms.
I love that Flexbox is one-dimensional, though, because it works great for components that auto-size to different sizing.
Yep. And, one of my big use cases was just horizontal menu bars. Couldn't really do them. Or rather, you could do them in 3 or 4 different ways, all of which had a ton of weird limitations. And if 2 of the limitations were balancing out, you needed this ability and this ability, and you could only achieve each with one type, you were screwed. And Flexbox finally does them all now.
So when I started in the early 2000s too, there was this big battle between print and the web, and CSS for print has evolved some with some of the CSS things that are with paged media and at print directive. So I guess typography has sort of been one of the pain points for me, and web fonts is a great increase. I love that we can use the web fonts. It beats using Arial or Times for everything, for sure.
Yeah.
But one of the things missing, when I studied some typography, was you can't have individual spacing between letters. It has to be like kerning and tracking, right? Tracking is space between entire words across the word, and kerning is the space between individual letters. So there's no differentiation between that and letter spacing, which is what we have in CSS now. There's no X height. There's no
now it's called something different.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, there is. Okay. So we can talk about that then. I mean, what's the deal with typography and what's the future? How can we make it better?
So we've got several people in the working group who are really excited about typography. For example, so big news, I just found out yesterday, the CSS working group co-chairs, Daniel Glasman and Peter Lintz, that have chaired the CSS working group for 7.5 years, just stepped down yesterday. And instead, we have 2 new co-chairs, Rossen Atonov from, I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, from Internet Explorer, and Alan Stearns from Adobe. And Alan is a big typography nerd, so there's interesting things there. In particular, he's the one in charge of he's been partially in charge of the Font Metrics API, which is a project for exposing better font information to the JavaScript. Related to that, we have the initial letter spec that's being developed in CSS right now, which is for better drop caps and whatnot. Right now, the only way to do drop caps is to float a first letter pseudo element, and it's actually really terrible typographically because there's rules about how you do a drop cap, like lining up the descenders and whatever. Yeah, lining up the baselines, etc. And floats don't do any of that. And so you need either something dedicated, the initial letter spec, or you need better font matrix so you can do it in JavaScript yourself, which we're developing in both ways. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that's interesting to hear now because back then it was a battle, and now I feel like there's this resurgence of people want to build, you know, magazines like flipboards or whatever. They want to have these things that are paged media that are on here that are similar to how you would work in like InDesign, right, in Adobe or Quark back in the day, and it would be like you have text boxes and you'd have content flow from one to the other, and we have that in CSS now, and we have shapes, and we have image cropping. We have I shouldn't say cropping, I should say masking.
Yes.
So clipping, masking, things like that, which are standard things you would use in print, and they were kind of scoffed at, like, we don't need that in the web. The web is not print. It's one or the other. And I like that now that we've had some time to like let it settle. It's sort of like becoming its own thing.
Well, there's also the fact that the web is print now. There's several CSS-based printing programs like Prince or Antenna House that let you. They are literally used to write books in CSS. In fact, if you look at Ribero's latest book, CSS Secrets or something, which I was a somewhat reviewer for, she wrote that in, I think, Antenna House, one of the CSS-based book processors. So that's an entire really beautiful book written in HTML and CSS and then published that way. So typography is important for that kind of thing, even if you're not using it on the web. But yes, the web itself, people are wanting to do a lot more stuff on there. They're moving publications more directly onto the web because who cares about paper anymore? I haven't bought a paper book on purpose for 3 or 4 years now. I just threw out most of my library and replaced it with ebooks because it's way more convenient.
It's so sad now. My printer is I can't buy ink because it just dries up so fast.
Yeah.
Right? It just sits there, and every time I need to print something, like a document that I need, let's say for the school for my son or the hospital or something, then I have to go to a FedEx or UPS or something to get someplace to get it printed. It's this whole hassle. Whereas it used to be so easy. Everyone printed every day. So it is a little weird in that sense.
Right. One interesting bit that's kind of semi-frustrating, but it's a consequence of how these things work out, is typography on the actual web, in terms of stuff you are putting on a web page, is still going to be less important than typography in things produced for books, magazines, etc. What you look at in a web page and what you look at in a book, people value typography a little bit more in one versus the other. And that, whereas people value a lot of features and whatnot on the web itself, all sorts of other things. What I'm getting at is when you're dealing with prioritization of features, what you should be implementing and focusing on, for actual web pages, we're still going, even though we have some more typography things being developed, we're still, in general, in browsers, probably going to be focusing more on other things and let the pretty features trickle in much more slowly. So it will take a while for them to actually reach the real web.
I honestly didn't really care so much for the typography initially when I was working with CSS, but as I started working more and more in the mobile space and seeing the pain of reading blogs and reading articles on my iPhone, which is like, I have no problem doing it on sites that are actually for that, right, where you have the type is the right size, you have this good space between, there's only a certain amount of characters across, single column, things like that. Once you feel that usability pain where you have to zoom in and scroll to read like a paragraph, like a simple paragraph, that's where it becomes priority for me.
That's why you use responsive web design.
Yeah, you have to these days.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so I'm also a member of the Responsive Images community group, and I wrote the spec for the modern picture element.
So that brings up a good point too. I know Scott Gell worked a little on the. He did the polyfill for that, and he wrote a recent book from a list apart on responsive web design, which was really awesome. If anyone has a chance to read it, I definitely would. But he talks a lot about responsive images, and you did image set, like instead of using in the background for a background rule in CSS, instead of using URL method, there's a new one that you had proposed. I don't know how far along is it now, but there's image. And in image, you can do these spriting things. You can do positioning on a sprite, and you can do image sets, which are similar to how picture works.
Yes.
And that's pretty amazing stuff. How do you see that working with the rise of HTTP 2 for mobile?
Okay, so there are several topics tied up in here. So you have responsive images, only shipping the image of the correct size that you need. So you don't send somebody a giant 2x image, it's 4 times as large or larger, when they only can display a 1x. So that's what's done by the source set attribute and more generally by the picture element. It's what's done by the image set function, which I can't actually take credit for. Apple just put it in Safari and was like, hey guys, there's a image set function here, you should spec it. So I spec'd it. And it
That's awesome.
Apple.
Hey, that's great. Community taking charge.
So it was a fine proposal, so I was happy to do that. But yeah, it's basically the same functionality as basic source set. You give a list of URLs along with the resolution of each, and the browser just chooses one to download as a background image or whatever. So the image function, on the other hand, has a few bits of functionality. One of the big ones, as you noted, is spriting. And HTTP 2 is interesting there because it doesn't have much of anything to do with responsive images. HTTP 2 doesn't help you select the right image to download, but it does help with spriting. The reason we sprited always was because establishing a network connection is the most expensive part, especially when you're downloading something small. And so you get to do one network connection, pull down all the images at once, and then just chunk the pieces you needed. HTTP 2 makes this easy because you just maintain one network connection and then pull down a whole bunch of different things at once. And in general, this should probably remove the need for spriting entirely. We'll see in practice. Once more people are using it, it's more widely available. We'll see how good it is at doing this. But the idea is that, yeah, you should just be able to throw spriting out the window. Have a bunch of individual images, it's fine. HTTP 2 will just download them all just as quickly or quicker than spriting. It will be quicker, ideally, because rather than having to wait for one big image to come down the pipe, you'll be able to see each individual image come down as they're used. And so should hopefully make it even more responsive than spriting does today.
Very cool. I noticed there's like XY coordinates and everything. And I remember having to do sprites manually before we had all this great tooling. I don't recommend anyone try it unless they want it as an academic exercise.
Yeah.
It is not fun. So when I saw this initially, I saw like these coordinates on there, and I'm like, oh no, how am I actually going to gauge this? So do you think you still need tooling for something like that to figure it out?
You don't need it, but it makes it a lot easier. Once image, so really that's keying into the media fragment spec, which is a general spec for I have some file, an image, a video, or whatever. I just want a piece of it. In images, it's usually I want this rectangle somewhere. In videos, though, it can be I want this segment of time. If you ever look at a YouTube video that's been cut down to only show you a piece of it, that stuff in the URL is actually a media fragment. They're doing it themselves, but they're following the spec exactly. It's just the browser isn't doing it for you. So the only thing is the image function requires you to implement the media fragment spec, at least for images, so that you can do spriting safely here.
Is there a way to polyfill that currently?
Not really, because it's a... So, yeah, you probably can, with difficulty. You'd have to... you'd have to do some complicated stuff.
Probably have to hook into the browser, I would think, right?
Yeah, it's unrecognized CSS for one, so it gets thrown out. You'd have to do something like use a variable instead, a custom property, and then just read it and parse what you're doing. Then you'd have to download the whole image and then cut out the piece, maybe bake it into a data URL and use that instead, like poke that into all the places in the style sheet that's asking for it. It would be complicated and hard. It's probably possible. I wouldn't recommend it.
Right. Use a big hammer.
Yeah, yeah. But that's also one of the things that custom paint from Houdini will make easier. If you need a new type of image thing, you can just sub one in, and then we'll be able to call you at the right time and just give you the information you need.
That's a good point too. I mean, that stuff is pretty amazing. That sounds very powerful. I really want to see that in a capacity where we can use it as developers and give feedback. Is that coming soon, you think?
Custom paint is one of the easier parts, probably, because there's less weird integration with the rest of the browser. And in general, we kind of already know how to handle this thing. We've had discussions for years about an off-screen canvas, a worker that can draw into a canvas for you so you're not running JavaScript on your main thread and janking things up with image generation. And so the idea, most of the idea behind custom paint has been around for several years already, and so it should come out fairly soon. By that I mean a year or two, probably, no more. It'll be faster than custom layout, for example, which is the most complicated part, probably.
Now, Nick had a question before he had to drop off. He was having trouble, technical trouble. He had a question on that, actually. So is there a worry about allowing custom CSS extensions leading to divergence of CSS in a way that people won't be able to transfer their knowledge from one project to the next?
It's a very real and reasonable fear, and yeah, probably. In a similar way now to if you develop an extensive set of Sass extensions or something for your job, they won't transfer to the next. If you use some weird custom JavaScript library, you'll have trouble working on a project that doesn't use it. And the same thing will now suddenly happen to CSS. There will be user-generated things. You will not necessarily be able to use them other places. And yes, that's a problem, but on the other hand, user-generated things. It's a good thing in general to have the ability to do language extensions and whatnot. I mean, for the most part, we're ultimately still just working with the functionalities that exist already in CSS, even though you're getting a lot of interfaces and getting able to tweak things a lot via Houdini stuff. So it won't be like fundamentally new things. It'll just be, oh, I needed this type of image. I remember my last job had some libraries to generate that kind of thing, and I don't here. Boo.
But you hit the nail on the head, though. Like, this is already a problem now beyond CSS. Like, no matter where you go, like, there's going to be tooling you have to learn. By far, it should not hold back the things that are happening in Houdini to make CSS better. Like, that would be to me, that's a fairly poor argument if anybody's going to make that argument. Like, you're just going to have to learn.
Yeah, and all it ultimately would do is, if you did try to hold it off, it'll just push more of the complexity into preprocessors and make them even more complicated. So here we're spreading out the burden a bit.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's going to be some standard ways to do this, which will help, like a defined, not necessarily defined process, but a loose process of how to create these.
Yeah, basically, I mean, you're going to have common hooks. Like, you'll have a paint function that can just invoke custom painters, or a custom, if you wanted codant gradients and we hadn't actually implemented them yet, you'll have a -- codant gradient function that'll do stuff. And it'll be obvious that you're using something custom. That double dash is the general rule for custom stuff around in CSS now. And so, yeah, you'll be able to see, like, what thing, at the very least, it's not like in JavaScript where you can be confused on what's a library and what's the browser. In CSS, it should be more obvious, so you'll know when you're depending on things that are custom and might not apply elsewhere.
And also, as far as that goes, like progressive enhancement and non-breaking changes. So like one of the things that Ribeiro talks about is like something like background. I forgot what the spec is, but background image filters, basically. Right. That is if it doesn't work in a browser, you're still going to see the image. Something like Flexbox breaks back, right? So you need some sensible alternative via some sort of @support, which is another directive that is supported on maybe one or two of the browsers.
Actually,
it is now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I haven't checked WebKit lately, but I guess what I'm getting at is, are most of the things that are prioritized, are they handled similarly to that, where it's like, okay, well, this will be put through faster because it's not something that's going to break if you use it on one browser or another if it's not supported. So those are things I would think to get adopted quicker. So are those prioritized higher?
They are when we can accomplish it. We always would like to make things so that they're kind of decorative in that sense. That the lack of them doesn't kill anything. But it's just not always possible. Layout specs are one of the big ones where you can't really progressively enhance like that. And although technically Flexbox you can often reproduce something close by using floats or something instead, because Flexbox doesn't allow floats, so it'll just ignore them.
Yeah, I've been playing around with that. There are some edge cases though that are really bugging me.
Oh yeah,
I think I just need a library.
There are some around there, but ultimately it's so yes, we do design for that when possible. We do specifically make design choices for a feature so that it works better, the fallback case when possible. But when we can't do it, as you mentioned, the @supports rule, I just looked it up on Can I Use. The @supports rule is usable everywhere. It will be it's everywhere in Firefox and Chrome. It's in Safari 9 and in IE Edge. So it's not usable in current Safari or current IE, but the next versions of both will have the @supports rule. So you'll be able to say, I need this thing to. If Flexbox works, here's all the Flexbox code. If it doesn't, here's all the whatever other code I have, and you won't have to try to get them to work together at the same time.
Yeah, one of the few things I do love about the Apple implementation of WebKit is that they usually auto-update everyone, right? It goes back pretty far, the devices. Yeah. You don't have as many issues as you would on Android devices. Probably the only thing that I really love.
We are trying our best to fix that for Android as well. Nowadays, unless a carrier is screwing things up, we do auto-update Chrome on browsers now. And so that's.
But even so, though, my understanding is that Chrome still has to use the JavaScript engine from WebKit.
Oh,
Apple won't allow it.
On iOS, yeah. There's only actually one browser on iOS. All the rest of us are just shells around Safari. The core of every iOS browser is Safari, or is the iOS browser itself.
And the benefit is you get to control upgrades and things like that for sure.
But on Android phones, at least, we're auto-updating Chrome, so it keeps up with the real Chrome, rather than back in the day when we were only update when you got a new phone.
And that's good to hear, though, that it has supports in it, and that Edge. I kind of figured Edge is I'm so impressed that the Edge team actually.
Yeah.
What they've been doing lately has been. I say this on a few episodes. Just having been that guy who fixed every IE bug that came our way. It's really a breath of fresh air to see how the team is taking it in such a great direction.
Yeah, and you should talk to them in person. They are so happy being able to jettison all the old crazy code.
I bet.
All that weird compat stuff, and just be finally we get to work on a modern browser. The engineers there are really happy about this, and they're all really good people.
And Rachel talks about CSS animations all the time and web animations, and I have to say I've worked a lot with the keyframes. I started using Daniel Eden's Animate CSS to get used to that, and that was really that made it so easy to just pick up web animations because you get to see these great examples.
Yes.
And go through it. And I love, one of the things is I saw that there's a spec for web animations, which is different than CSS animations. And there's motion paths, which is pretty awesome.
So I can talk about those.
Getting closer and closer to what Flash was without the bad parts.
Yeah, basically.
so how do all these fit together? Because there's libraries like Famous, for instance, right? They're always striving for that 60 frames per second. They're always pushing the limits and trying to work with these things, and they're doing all these hacks on top of CSS animations to make it work. In their new one, they're actually the new version, the engine that they have. They're using WebGL for when that's more optimal, and then when it's not, they're going to use the DOM, document object model. So how do these all work? The animations.
Okay, so one thing you have to understand is that CSS animations were designed for a very specific thing. They're abused for all sorts of animation-related things, but they're really just designed for spinners and similar things, where you have some repeating animation while something is in a state. That's all it's for. Everything else we do, trying to animate something from one state to the next, that is an abuse of the model. That works really well. We've been able to do great things with it, but it's not what it's designed for, and it shows. It's just the whole syntax and everything about it does not work with that kind of thing. So web animations is an attempt to just make JavaScript do CSS-style animations properly. So you get all the same acceleration benefits that CSS animations enjoy, but with a much more convenient syntax that's actually designed to handle, I need a one-off animation from this value to this value while I'm transferring states or whatever. And we're actually, internally now, web animation, the people that did web animations, it's actually the Chrome team in Sydney for us. They wrote the web animation spec along with Brian Bertels from Mozilla. They implemented it in our browser and actually rewrote all of our other animations in terms of the new web animations engine underneath. So CSS animations are just web animations, like via the JS API, basically. They're invoked via magical internal browser stuff, but whenever you run a CSS animation, it's essentially just doing a JS web anim for you. And in fact, the API even exposes that. You can ask something for its animations, and it'll return the CSS ones as well as any JS ones that are running, because they're all the same thing. Related to that, you mentioned motion path. That's actually trying to take a feature from SVG animation, which is the animate motion element, and expose it to CSS. Because using, again, CSS animations, it was very inconvenient to make something move in anything but straight lines. If you want to do a translate and have something curve in, you had to do a lot of trig and put together a lot of keyframes to make a translate X and a translate Y like work correctly as it went along. Translate motion or motion path instead just lets you specify a path, a curvy path or whatever, using like the SVG style syntax or a circle or something, and just handles all that for you then. Easy motion around the page in any path you want. And then that's also usable via web animations. You just animate the motion path property.
I foresee D3 implementing this soon.
Absolutely, yes. It will make things a lot simpler and less computationally intensive for them.
Well, that's pretty awesome. There's one thing we had David Walsh and Anna Tudor on for one episode, and we talked about math and calculation in CSS. And since I started using Sass, like I said, 2009-ish, I really loved the fact that I can leverage Ruby's percentage and different types of math. If I needed to have these things in there to calculate things on build time. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, wow, at runtime, those calculations, because now we have all these other units that we can use, would be really valuable.
Yeah.
So how do you foresee programming with CSS? Because a lot of people don't consider this a thing. They think that CSS cannot be programmed. It's just like a bastard child of the web.
Those people have a very restrictive and incorrect view of what a programming language is.
Agreed.
CSS transforms a DOM tree into a display on the page. That's a programming language. It's doing things, just as much as tech is or something. But anyway, so we have calc, the calc function in CSS, widely supported, usable. Should we use it today? It can only do some things. It can add together similar types of units, like two types of lengths, a pixel and an M length, for example, which Sass can't do directly. It can
which is awesome, by the way.
Yeah. It can multiply and it can divide by numbers, and that's it. So you can just do sums of ratios and whatnot. You cannot, however, do a sine function or a tangent function, which are really useful for a lot of the geometry stuff that Anna does. You can't do figure out a ratio from two lengths and then use that in a number, because you can't divide a length by another length. We don't allow unit algebra to happen. So these kinds of things I actually expect will be under the province of Houdini. We'll probably just be able to add custom. One of the things that's on the table is custom functions in CSS, which will be backed by JavaScript. You can just put whatever, -- calc, put whatever you want in there. It'll get passed to the JavaScript function that's registered for it, and that will turn it into some reasonable length for you, or whatever it is that you need. And I expect that will let Sass move a lot of its stuff and similar processors, move a lot of its calculation into runtime to a lot of really interesting benefit, because you'll be able to pass in whatever syntax you want. That's the big limitation right now.
And I know for now it's going to be people are going to still use preprocessors, and I love them. SAS,
Yeah.
like I said, is my one of choice. But sometimes it's frustrating. I can't use the libsass if I want to do like heavier math. Things like that are not supported in there. Compass adds a lot of great things to SAS that's not there as well, even in Ruby.
Yeah,
Do you think that people are gonna just get rid of them eventually because there won't be a need for it, or do you think it'll be working hand in hand just in a different way?
The latter there. We're not trying to get rid of preprocessors. We're trying to relieve some of the pressure on them, some of the things they've been forced to do just because the platform couldn't, and some of the things that they're doing in suboptimal ways right now because they're much better done in the browser. One example of that is the extend thing from SAS.
Yeah.
Very hacky implementation by necessity to make it work as a preprocessor. Natalie and Chris and whatnot have done wonderful work in making it reasonable, but like a correct implementation of extend makes your style sheets explode in size because you need an exponential increase in the number of selectors. And so they use a lot of weird heuristics to tell what subset they only need to put out that'll likely work. Doing that in the browser would be much simpler. You wouldn't need to have all that weirdness. You'd be able to handle every case correctly and easily because it's not a matter of doing a lot of weird selector munging. So that's an example of something that like preprocessors are doing today. They shouldn't have to, and we better moved into the real browser. And those are the kind of things that hopefully Houdini will relieve some pressure on. There's still a lot of things that are best done in a preprocessor. A lot of work that doesn't need to be done live. Some types of things that can't be done live because they're too expensive to run on the client, and it's better to just run them once on a server, put out the processed output, and you're done. And that's where I see preprocessors still being very useful today. I write a spec preprocessor. I'm the maintainer of a project called BikeShed that helps you write specifications, and it's an offline processor. It's like SAS or whatever that generates HTML that you then put up on there. There's another preprocessor that's common around the web called Respec that's JavaScript, and it does all of it on the client. You load up the source file, then the JavaScript runs and transforms everything for you. And there are things you fundamentally cannot do in Respec that BikeShed can do. And so preprocessors will never go away. They're useful.
React Native has sort of set out this trend of doing inline styles. And then Chris Corrier recently had a publication on CSS tricks I saw. Where, do we really need, CSS, right? Because of all this. And it was more of, let's just talk about it.
Yeah.
But, the trending mobile native using the JavaScript API is using React, and React will generate these inline styles. And to me, that seems so unmaintainable, but they claim the performance is so great. How do you feel about those type of things?
I actually feel pretty good about them. There's some interesting benefits to be had from moving things inline. It's never something you should do by hand. The entire point of CSS, the cascade, inheritance, etc., selectors, was to make it easy to author style sheets. You could apply an entire page without having to rewrite styles on every single element you need to style. And it's still doing that job appropriately, but there are performance benefits from putting things inline. Sometimes. You have to counter them with the repetition that makes for larger pages and whatnot. But in at least some cases, you can get performance benefits out of inline styles. You don't have to pay for style recalculation anymore, no selectors to match or anything. Those are a significant part of why pages are slow sometimes. And so React's ideas are really interesting and really good within certain constraints. I like them a lot. One of my coworkers, in fact, has been playing around with, I forget what he called the project, basically taking a page, rendering it with normal CSS, finding all the styles, and then generating a static version of it that can be used instead. And he's finding that, that has, when he's doing a lot of telemetry and a lot of measurement of where various costs are coming from inside the browser, he's finding significant benefits from this kind of thing. So React is on the right track if you're willing to buy into their framework.
Well, I was actually on a project where we did that to generate HTML. Sorry, and we had a very large team, so we really needed to make it more maintainable, and we did that using SAS and some other Ruby stuff, but it basically would copy those into the styles, and we never tested it for performance. We were more concerned with getting it to work across the different email clients, so it's interesting.
Yeah, for emails, all bets are off. They're the worst. I still use tables for layout whenever I have to write an email because it's terrible. Tables are still in the year 2000 in terms of CSS styling.
So moving forward, what do you think? I know you had mentioned in your talk about, the future of CSS is polyfills, right? Polyfilling CSS. So that was over a year ago, though. Do you still feel that way, or do you feel like, what's the big gaps that we need to fill?
So I've spent the past year working on that. So yes, I do still believe in that. That's Houdini.
That's promising.
In addition to everything else that I do, of course. The Houdini project is all about making polyfills actually work for CSS. Today, they barely do. And I think that's the way we can keep the language viable and keep the web itself working better as we move into the future. And so I'm going to continue working on that for the next several years, probably. It's where the benefit is, I believe.
PageSpeed does quite a bit of CSS delivery stuff, in terms of not polyfilling, but in terms of render tree construction and things like that, where it tries to optimize a lot of the things, similar to a lot of the inline styling that happens. If you've ever used mod PageSpeed or the Nginx version of it, or you have versions for IIS as well, so there's a lot of things that do this automatically for you, where you still get the benefit of it. But that's not really that's sort of the last thing as opposed to the polyfilling thing, which, yay, polyfills.
Yeah, one of the things that with the preprocessors on a large team that always bothered me was the nesting, because at first it's like, wow, this is amazing, this is so great, and then you end up spending an entire sprint cleaning up CSS that was like, the performance selectors are really bad. So whenever I see pseudo selectors and things like that in the browser, I do worry because I know those aren't as performant too. So things like matches, to me, I'm not sure how performant it'll be when it's actually implemented, or if it is. Is that something that's being looked at when it's implemented?
Yeah, well, it's already implemented in Firefox. It's under the name -mos-ini instead of matches. But they've had it for years, actually. That's why it got put in spec. And matches itself actually isn't that, well, at least in some cases, it's just a simple rewriting of a selector. If you just have colon matches A, B, it's the same as writing just two selectors, with one with an A and one with a B in it. And so performance is fine in that way. Yeah, in general, you're right. Pseudo selectors and things like that, pseudo classes, etc., generally are much slower than normal selectors. You want to stick ideally with classes and tag names. Those are the fast things. And one of the nice things about being able to use components and whatnot is that you can stick to simpler CSS because you're not having to worry about accidentally polluting an entire page. You can write much faster CSS in terms of just faster selectors, and then because they're running over a smaller chunk, they're faster to apply, and just everything's nice and fast all over the place when you can cut things up a little bit more with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's great. How do you feel about stuff like, modular CSS, like using BEM or OOCSS or SMAX or any of that?
I haven't actually used any of them besides just a touch of OOCSS, but seems like a fine idea, but also it largely seems like selector hacks around the lack of real components. And as web components gets implemented fully in every browser, I think we will see a lot less need for that kind of thing. And as we replace them with real component-based usage, you'll get much better performance out of it anyway. BIM and OOCSS and whatnot while they are performance enhancers because they simplify your CSS, they're largely organizational aids. It's just that more organized CSS also performs better.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And, we're not big web component fans here, so.
Never heard of them.
Yeah.
What's that stuff? That polymer thing? Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's good to hear. I was really excited with the Polymer 1.0 again with the CSS variables because I felt it was very hard to theme things without using /deep, which is now deprecated. From what I saw on the scoped module, am I correct in saying that?
Correct. Yeah. As part of the let's get Apple to agree to implement this, we dropped those, and we were happy with it anyway because they're really slow. Deep was terrible. Everything you know that
yeah.
the descendant selector slow, deep was that times 10. And so variables are one way to get around that. Because you can establish a theme. You just use a bunch of variables inside of your component, and then people will just set them on the root. They inherit in, style it up for you. And we're hopefully going to have some better ways to target specific things. Because, variables let you set up a couple of, theming things. So you get to have a few knobs you can twiddle on the component, theme colors, secondary color, some widths or whatnot, but you don't get arbitrary control over a specific piece of it. If you just want to do a bunch of different types of styles over some bit of it, you can't without having to put in a whole bunch of variables. And so something we want to do is allow some way to have custom pseudo elements probably that point into a shadow DOM, so that you can say, here's access, full access, whatever you want, to some particular piece of it. That way you'll have both the broad but annoying to use more than a few theming possibilities of variables, and the much more narrow but letting you do whatever you want theming possibilities of custom pseudo elements pointing into a component. And hopefully the two
Are you talking like styling? Are you talking about styling the placeholder, how that works natively?
Precisely. Yeah. So the colon placeholder, or all of the. Basically, if you go look at the list of WebKit pseudo elements, most of them are just ways to style pieces of inputs and things like that. And all of those should be done properly through web components, exposing these kinds of things to CSS.
Well, we're running close to time. Is there any other questions that you guys have, or Tab, anything that maybe we missed that's pretty important? And I do want to clarify, I did get yelled at by one person on Twitter. There is no CSS4, right?
Yes, I have a blog post about it.
Okay, just checking.
Yes.
I want to make sure I'm right.
There is
I
CSS.
used that in a very relaxed manner on Twitter, and
yeah,
I was corrected. So I just want to make sure. So there are level 4 modules out there, just no CSS4.
There's also level 1 and 2 modules, which are advanced. Our numbering scheme is arcane and weird. Ignore it.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. I gotcha. Okay. So if people want to find you, Tab, what's the best way to catch you? What's your Twitter handle? And how can people help contribute to these projects?
All right. So best way to contact me is through Twitter. It's my name, Tab Atkins. Tab Atkins. An at sign in it. I'm really responsive on there. You can send me emails, but I usually prefer Twitter. It's just easier. If you want to contribute to CSS, we would love to have feedback on problems you're having that you think we need to do something to solve. Hearing about problems is way easier than hearing about solutions you think, because usually we might have already been trying to solve that, or there might already be something to exist like your solution, and so hearing your problem is a lot better, so we can tell you what's wrong, or we can tell what we need to add later on. So anyway, you can email www-style@w3.org. That's the CSS Working Group mailing list. Or you can email the Houdini mailing list, which is public-houdini@w3.org. Both of those are public mailing lists. Anyone can email them. There may be a moderation delay depending on if the spam filter catches you or something. But anybody can post. It's wide open, and we'd love to hear from authors about these kinds of things.
Very cool. All right, well, thank you so much for coming on, Tab.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and looking forward to the stuff you guys are doing over at at the CSS Working Group.
Yeah, me too.
All right, thanks a lot.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Erik Isaksen at eIsaksen,
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.